Okay, we're back with part two of our conversation with Elisabeth Clemens of the University of Chicago, author of Civic Gifts, the well-received and well-reviewed Civic Gifts book, which we began talking about in part one, at the end of which we were speaking about Herbert Hoover in particular, but the relationship between, I'll say, philanthropy, charity, the nonprofit sector, and government in general. So what lessons would I, if I'm a philanthropist, hypothetically, what can I draw from Civic Gifts, or what should I draw from Civic Gifts?
Well, I think the first lesson is to understand the long process of political construction of philanthropy and charity. At its beginning, philanthropy depends on creating foundations, which are corporations, which are created by government. That brings with it some unnatural capabilities to give after the death of an individual. By the late 19th and 20th century, to give with tax benefits, first from state inheritance taxes and eventually from federal income taxes in World War I and from business taxes in 1935 in the heart of the New Deal, and to give anonymously. So there are a set of legal constraints and advantages that come with this political construction of charity and philanthropy in the contemporary world. I think we're seeing that under strain in many ways in the US, but also around the world. And we won't effectively address those strains unless we recognize that there is a politics to constructing that distinction, to constructing charity and philanthropy as a field of activity that is legally constrained and legally advantaged.
Who's creating those strains, the current strains, and what could be done about it?
So I think there are a number. Part of the reason philanthropy and foundations have long been seen as dangerous is that they are channels for the impact of wealth on public issues in democratic government. You can think of them as places where wealth undergoes a kind of alchemy and wealthy people become leading citizens. And there's been a longstanding fear that that undercuts democratic processes, that was magnified in the fights over the Rockefeller Foundation, which was unprecedentedly large, but which is tiny, the Rockefeller Foundation then, compared to what we're seeing now. So we're seeing an intensification of a long-standing concern about the influence of wealth in democracy. And then we're also seeing, I think, increasingly complicated ways in which philanthropy is addressing issues that many people might think of as public, whether that's, social needs of education, homelessness, public health, or more directly political issues, such as the current controversies over foundations giving grants to help local governments manage elections during COVID, which has now been met by a series of laws saying, no, you can't do that. And then one might think around the globe about new laws in China and Russia most prominently that restrict the role of international foundations and foreign foundations. So I think the politics around this boundary between the philanthropic and the strictly political are increasingly visible and increasingly contested.
And that could be a healthy thing.
It could be a healthy thing.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
It could be, I suppose. Well, do you think it could be a negative thing, or do you? Is it? is it a hope that it'll be a healthy thing, or what's going to happen?
I think it's an inevitable thing. Once you recognize that there is no natural division, which is encouraged by our language of third sector, independent sector. I mean, as nonprofit scholars and scholars of philanthropy, the language itself encourages us to think about, bracket this off, study in its own terms. And that misses something that is terrifically important and is more pressing and more contested. And if we don't acknowledge the politics of that and some of the trade-offs between voluntarism, democratic values, openness versus interference, if that's not recognized, those who care about voluntarism and philanthropy will get the politics wrong by ignoring it.
Right. And by politics, you mean, I guess, what some people might say, small Peapod. I mean, you study what groups of people do, which means by definition, there's politics in there. So if I asked you whether philanthropy is too politicized, I really mean to ask you whether philanthropy might be becoming too partisan, I guess. Do you think it is?
Well, sort of 2 points. One is, I think that it's important for philanthropy to recognize that it is by definition a-democratic, not necessarily anti-democratic, but it operates on very different principles. And it's important to recognize the implications of that. In terms of whether philanthropy more generally is politicized or too politicized, I don't want to make comments about the domains as a whole, because I think many donors, many foundations are doing what they're doing and have long done in terms of meeting local needs and experimenting with new methods. But I think there's no question but the intersection has gotten energized and hot. So maybe not the domain as a whole, but certainly the issues are more prominent.
Mm-hmm. Charity and civil society. Do charity and civil society need to have both philanthropy and government, or is one okay over the other? And what's the proper relationship between philanthropy and government in serving the needs of defending, helping charity and civil society?
Personally, I think that should be a democratic choice. Yeah. Colleagues in Europe, and particularly in Scandinavia, think that the way in which Americans take care of social needs is just incomprehensible. Why do you do it in this strange, complicated way? And because of that, they have embraced a different set of choices in terms of tax burdens, in terms of coverage, in terms of the philosophy of relief. So there's not, I think, a universal right or wrong, but these are trade-offs that we make as a democratic country together.
Mm-hmm. If one observed that government's share of responsibility, of a role in helping civil society seems to inevitably grow. I guess you can't say seems and inevitably but has it ever shrunk or declined? It always grows, right? Government, it's a one-way ratchet. Government's usually, if not almost always, growing in terms of that share as we've set it up, as I have.
There certainly is that tendency, although the slopes of that growth are really different in different countries. Where I think you should think about the importance of philanthropy, though, is it's the money at the margin, right? That, the philanthropic funds going into something like K-12 education, they pale in terms of total spending on K-12 education. But the money at the margin is more disproportionately philanthropic, right? So as someone who has lived in the world of economists, you appreciate that, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Could any president, do lead a March of Dimes effort like Roosevelt's again, or are we too polarized for that? One could foresee, in other words, if it was a Democratic president, a liberal president, criticism from the more progressives, well, that's ridiculous. We need government to do this. And a conservative would be criticized for privatizing what government should be doing, I suppose, as well. But could we have a March of Dimes grow up again the way it did as described in your book?
So one thing is to recognize how politicized both the Red Cross came to be, identified with Republicans, and the March of Dimes with Democrats. So people would say, well, I'll give to the March of Dimes, but I won't give on Roosevelt's birthday. I won't do that. And there is an effort to ratchet down the March of Dimes post-World War II because it's seen as too linked to the Democratic Party. I think the answer looking forward really lies in the experience of all the repeated efforts to create youth service, right? Which have happened under Republican and Democratic presidents alike for the past, really since the 1960s. And I think you'd have to say that maybe the Peace Corps was the last that really got the kind of traction that we saw in the 20s and 30s.
Mm-hmm. Does the solidarity creating, enforcing notion of civic benevolence, does that have to be national?
It doesn't. And I think this is one of the things that has come out both of the literature on philanthropy and education, which is something I've read, in that we see real differences across metropolitan areas, that in some places you get very effective coalitions of a local foundation, nonprofits, and local government working together to really produce something quite extraordinary. So that sort of back to thinking locally and regionally is, I think, very important. And I think the other lesson is directly from what we've seen during the pandemic, and specifically the revival of a discussion of mutual aid. And just thinking of what happens in Chicago, a very political city, you've seen efforts by activists and aldermen to do these very 1910s, 20s thing. There's a big snowstorm. Well, let's call people together and dig out the sidewalks of our elderly neighbors. And you sort of expect that those people will then be more likely to show up at a protest of city policy, or to make a case to their neighbors and families to vote in the next election. So I think we've seen a kind of revival at the really local grassroots that's reminiscent of earlier forms. Whether it will build into anything, another question.
Yes. Would it be fair to think that that kind of local mutual aid is part of our national identity?
It is certainly part of what sociologists would call our national repertoire or toolkit. This is how we know how to do stuff. So in mobilizing for a crisis, you see these really familiar scripts coming out that will bring together different people. We'll have, hospitality worker unions, hotels, and hospitals working together to create surge space for COVID patients in, spring of 2020. You saw this kind of choreography of public and private groups that was the hallmark of someone like Hoover. You saw that come back up as a first response. So whether it defines us as a nation, I wouldn't go so far. But I would say it's a really important piece of the skill set.
Yeah. You have a next book or project in mind?
I do. I am working on what I think is a really important, if often profoundly boring topic, which is thinking about contracting and the role of private firms in constructing governing capacity. Basically, the system I described in Civic Gifts persists from the Civil War through World War II. And then you can think about it as being the sort of shell that then is inhabited by another creature like a hermit crab. Many of the sort of legal openings for voluntary associations then get occupied by private firms, and state building post-World War II increasingly draws on the capacities of private firms as well as nonprofit organizations.
Great. Well, all right. I think we can maybe finish up there, Professor Clemens, if that's okay with you, author of Civic Gifts, which you should all run out and pick up. Thanks so much for doing this.
Okay, well, thank you for a great conversation, Michael.
Okay, we can finish it out there. Well, that was fun. I would have wanted to, grill you more on the politics, right? But and it's funny, like when you talking about your next book, I'm thinking, well, okay, that's a charter schools should be a chapter of that book on charter schools.
Yeah.
There would be many with whom I'm familiar, Bill Chamber, my co-editor,
Mm-hmm.
who would love that, but both in Civic Gifts and it seems in your next book, it's the private groups paved the way towards government, taking up it, learning lessons from it, growing though.
Yeah.
But so conservatives sometimes are for that, I guess, in the case of vouchers, right? That's a government program, and sometimes they're not. But okay, right. And of course, progressives would be uncomfortable with charter schools. Certainly, they didn't like private people running the schools. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, you've got great ideological cross currents in the world, which are
well. And actually, one of those side projects was on charter schools, in Arizona in the late 1990s, because you had a legislatively created industry. Like, how fascinating was that? It turns out that the sociologists of education weren't really interested in that question, and the organization scholars didn't really think that schools were organizations anymore because they're so focused on for-profit firms. But yeah, I mean, that process of taking something that had been a defining piece of public social provision in the United States since the 1840s, right? That was where the US was absolutely a leader in terms of public social provision, while European welfare states were doing pensions of various sorts. So charter schools are an absolutely fascinating place where you see this contestation over private control.
Yeah.
And it's like, I don't have kids in school, but the charter school language about schools and parents and teachers when they are tax supported, I think, well, like, as a taxpayer, why do I not have some say in this, in the character of the schools that I'm paying for? But you get the construction of a conversation that really excludes the taxpayer and the community as a whole in some places, certainly not in every places, but that is it actually was the first empirical place where I started moving back. And I think, really since the post-World War II period, the way I describe the role of the federal government is it really raises money and attaches that money to rules and then sends it to other organizations, whether state and local government, private firms, nonprofits. And that I do think is deeply problematic for issues of accountability. And, we've built a government where no one can answer the question of what are your tax dollars doing for you? The organization of the government makes that an impossible question. And I think that's deeply problematic. Now, one response, the conservative response is, well, make government smaller, simpler. Another response would be to make government more transparent and really recognize the flows of funds. But I think the problem is there for both sides.
Yeah, and for both sides and on both questions, it exists within philanthropy itself. Make sure you know what the money's being spent on and who gets to dictate terms, right, or whatever, guardrails, whatever. Okay. All right, well, I will stop wasting your time. I totally appreciate you doing this, though. And let's consider the ball in my court. And I'll probably just send you the little write-ups that'll be over each part, which is just going to be a couple paragraphs of your bio, talk about the book, and then a brief summary to the degree I can do it, quoting from you for each respective part, if that makes sense.
That sounds absolutely great.
Great. So I'll send you a Word file next. Give me time. I've got.
Okay. And when you send that, would you send the review from Giving Review?
Yes, I will.
One of the things that's sort of fallen through the cracks with the press is the whole system of doing, tear sheets of reviews.
Yes. Okay. I will do that.
Okay.
I think you'll like it. I mean,
Good.
I don't know, of course, but interesting.
As my advisor said, any publicity is good publicity, right?
You spell your name right, and in your case, that's relevant with Elizabeth.
It is highly relevant, yeah.
Yes, okay. All right, well, thank you so much. So I'll be
Okay.
in touch next. I totally appreciate it.
Thank you. This was so much fun. Okay, bye-bye.